The warp storm broke the sky above the feudal world of Griffin 5, and it was not a normal storm because it was a tear in reality that the Inquisition records call the event of the Black Sun. Millions of people died in the first hour as the laws of physics stopped working and gravity failed while blood rained from the clouds. The local population had no defense against the creatures that poured out, because these were not soldiers. They were monsters from the nightmares of humanity, known as demons. They ate the flesh of the living and drank the souls of the dying, and the planetary defense forces collapsed instantly, so there was no order, only screaming. Then the silver ships arrived from the moon of Titan, and they were the Grey Knights, who are the secret warriors of the Emperor. They fight the things that cannot exist, and they do not save populations, they save the human soul, by destroying the corruption. Grand Master Voldus led the strike force with orders to secure the rift and closed the gate and kill anything that had touched the warp, which usually meant killing everyone on the planet. The Grey Knights teleported into the center of the carnage wearing heavy Terminator armor and carrying Stormbolters and Nemesis Force weapons, expecting to find only demons and no survivors. They moved through the ruined castle town and fired explosive bolts that blew the diamonds apart. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and rotten meat. The Grey Knights felt the psychic pressure of the warp, trying to crush their minds, but they held firm because their faith was their shield. They reached the town square where the warp rift was strongest, and they prepared for a final stand against the never-born entities. They were wrong because the square was already silent. In the middle of the lake of blood, there was a hill of bodies that were not human, but were piles of twisted red flesh of lesser demons rotting in the mud. The smell was awful, and in the center of this slaughter stood one man who was not a space marine or a genetically modified super soldier, but a normal human male. He was huge and covered in his own blood and the black blood of the monsters, and he was missing his right eye while his left arm was gone cut off at the elbow. He was dying, but he was still standing, and in his right hand he held a slab of iron that was too thick to be a sword and too heavy for a normal man to lift. It was a raw heap of iron, but the Grey Knights saw the truth that the blade was soaked in warp energy, and it had killed so many demons that it had become something else existing on both the physical plane and the spiritual plane. The man swung the iron slab and cut a surviving demon in half, and the Grey Knights stopped because this was impossible, since a human cannot kill a demon with physical steel alone, as the creature's soul usually survives. But this sword killed the soul too. The man looked at the silver giants, and he did not ask for help or beg for mercy, but growled like a wounded wolf and tried to lift the sword again, but his body failed, and he fell into the mud. Grand Master Voldus approached the fallen warrior and scanned the man's mind, expecting to find corruption, or a man who had sold his soul to Khorne, the blood god, for power, but he found nothing but rage. It was a cold and pure rage that acted like a shield against the warp, and the man was not corrupted, he was just angry. On the man's neck there was a mark that bled and pulsed with dark light, and it was a beacon that drew the monsters to him like moths to a flame. Voldus realized that this man was a living trap for demons. Voldus signaled the apothecaries to take him and the sword, because this was not a rescue mission. It was a recovery of a dangerous asset. The event of the Black Sun ended with the destruction of the planet by cyclonic torpedoes, as the Grey Knights returned to their ship with their prisoner. They had found something that defied their archives, and they had found the struggler. Excited Arbid I. The transport ship touched down on the frozen surface of Titan, and the landing gear crushed the ancient ice that had covered the moon for thousands of years. The air outside was methane and nitrogen, and it was cold enough to freeze a normal man instantly, but inside the ship, the temperature was controlled. The Grey Knights carried the unconscious body of the warrior named Guts down the ramp, and they moved with heavy metallic steps that echoed in the silence of the fortress monastery. They did not take him to a prison cell, because he was not a criminal yet, and they did not take him to a guest room, because he was a potential threat. So they took him to the Apothecarium, which is the medical wing of the fortress. The walls were made of dark stone and covered in silver writing that glowed with a faint blue light. These writings were wards meant to keep demons out and to keep dangerous things in. The Grey Knights placed Guts on a surgical table made of cold steel, and they strapped his chest and legs down with adamantium chains that were strong enough to hold an ogrin. Apothecary Galen stood over the body, and he was a giant compared to the human. Galen wore white power armor, and his helmet had complex sensors that scanned the patient's body. He activated a medical servitor, which was a mindless drone that floated nearby with needles and saws attached to its metal arms. Galen began the examination, and he spoke into his Vox recorder to log the findings for the archives. The first thing he noticed was the sheer amount of damage the human body had taken over its life. The scanner showed that almost every bone in Guts' body had been broken at least once and had healed poorly. There were burns and cuts and bite marks from creatures that did not match any known Xena species in the Imperial database. Galen saw that the man's muscle density was higher than a normal human, but he was not genetically modified like a space marine. He was just a man who had pushed his body beyond the limits of biology through pure force of will. The most concerning thing was the mark on the man's neck. Galen moved his sensor closer to the brand of sacrifice, and the machine sparked and gave a warning signal. The mark was bleeding slightly, and the blood hissed when it touched the metal table. Galen felt a wave of cold sickness wash over him, even through his power armor, because the mark was a direct link to the warp. It was a beacon that screamed into the immaterium and invited monsters to come and feed. Galen prepared a purity seal, which is a piece of parchment with holy prayers written on it, and he placed it near the neck to dampen the psychic noise. The man groaned, and his single eye snapped open. Guts woke up, and he did not wake up slowly like a normal person coming out of a coma. He woke up with a roar, and he pulled against the chains with explosive force. The adamantium links held firm, but the steel table creaked under the stress. Guts looked around the room with his one good eye, and he saw the white-armored giant and the floating machines, and he bared his teeth like a trapped animal. He tried to reach for his sword, but his hand grasped only empty air, and he realized his metal arm was gone. The Grey Knight had removed his prosthetic arm during transport because it contained a hidden cannon, and they considered it a weapon. Guts shouted and demanded to know where he was, but he spoke a language that was a primitive form of Low Gothic that was hard to understand. Galen did not flinch, and he pressed a button on the console that released a sedative gas into the air above the table. Guts held his breath and stared at the apothecary with intense hatred. Galen spoke calmly and told the subject to cease resistance. He explained that he was in the citadel of Titan and that he was under the custody of the Emperor's Inquisition. Guts did not care about the Emperor or the Inquisition, and he only cared that his sword was gone and that he was trapped. He strained against the chains again, and the metal of the table began to bend. 2 Grey Knight Terminators stepped out of the shadows of the room. They were much larger than Galen, and they carried storm bolters and force halberds. They pointed their weapons at Guts and waited for the orders to fire. Grand Master Voldus entered the room, and the Terminators lowered their weapons. Voldus was the leader of the Third Brotherhood, and he was a powerful psyker who could crush a tank with his mind. He walked up to the table and looked down at the struggling human. Voldus did not use gas or chains to calm the man. He used his psychic power to project a wave of authority and calm directly into Guts' brain. Guts stopped struggling, but he did not relax. He felt the intrusion in his mind, and he pushed back with a wall of pure rage. Voldus was surprised because usually a human mind crumbles instantly under his touch, but this man's mind was like a fortress of iron spikes. The rage was not chaotic, and it was not the hot anger of Khorne. It was a cold and human stubbornness that refused to submit to anything. Voldus spoke to Guts and asked him his name and where he came from. Guts spat blood on the floor and said his name. He said he came from a land that the Imperium did not know. Voldus asked about the sword and the mark. Guts laughed a dry and bitter laugh and said the mark belonged to the god Hand, and the sword was the only thing that could hurt them. Voldus did not know the term god Hand, but he understood that it referred to powerful demon princes. Voldus signaled the apothecary to check the man's vitals again. The stress of the interrogation was causing the brand to bleed more, and the room temperature dropped 10 degrees in a second. Shadows began to pool in the corners of the medical bay. These were not normal shadows, but the manifestations of lesser warp entities that were drawn to the bleeding mark. A small rift tried to open near the ceiling, and a clawed hand reached through. The Terminators raised their weapons and fired a single synchronized burst of explosive bolts that shattered the manifestation before it could fully form. Guts did not look surprised. He looked tired. He told them that this would happen every night, and that they should kill him or let him go because he was a cursed man. Voldus realized that keeping this man on Titan was a risk to the security of the entire chapter. The brand acted as a summoning ritual that never ended. However, the Imperium does not throw away weapons, and Voldus saw that Guts was a weapon. The fact that he had survived this curse for years without being corrupted proved that he had a resistance to the warp that was statistically impossible. Voldus ordered the tech priest to enter the room. The priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus wore red robes and had mechanical limbs, and they were responsible for the technology of the Imperium. They brought a cart covered in a white cloth. Under the cloth was Guts' artificial arm. The tech priests had examined the arm, and they were disgusted by its crude design. It was a primitive mechanical device that used gears and magnets and a simple magnetic locking system. It had a single-shot cannon built into the wrist, which the priests considered dangerous and unstable. They had repaired the damage to the mechanism, and they had blessed it with sacred oils to appease the machine spirit, even though they doubted the device had a true spirit. They also brought a new set of armor. Guts' old armor was destroyed in the battle on Griffin 5. The new armor was made of ceramite plates used by Imperial scouts, and it was painted gunmetal grey. It was not power armor, so it did not enhance his strength, but it was durable and sealed against toxic environments. Voldus gave Guts a choice. He said that Guts could be executed right now as a heretic and a danger to the state, or he could serve the Grey Knights as a sanctioned auxiliary. He would not be a brother, and he would not be a space marine. He would be a hound that they unleashed upon the enemies of mankind. Guts looked at the silver giant and asked if he would get his sword back. Voldus nodded. Guts asked if he would get to kill the monsters. Voldus nodded again. Guts told them to release the chains. The tech priests attached the metal arm to Guts' stump. The connection was painful because they had to fuse the Imperial nerve plugs with his scarred flesh. Guts gritted his teeth and did not scream. He tested the fingers of the metal hand, and the magnets clicked with a loud snap. The arm was heavier than his old one, but it felt solid. He stood up from the table, and his joints popped. He was taller than a normal human, but he still had to look up to meet the eyes of the Space Marines. He felt the weight of the gravity on Titan, which was slightly lower than Earth standard, and he felt light. They led him out of the Apothecarion. and down a long spiral staircase that went deep into the rock of the moon. The air got colder, and the smell of incense got stronger. They reached the armory, where the weapons of the chapter were kept. In the center of the room, on a reinforced rack, lay the Dragonslayer. The sword looked out of place among the finely crafted power swords and nemesis halberds of the Grey Knights. The Grey Knight weapons were elegant and glowed with blue energy. The Dragonslayer was a slab of raw iron that looked like a heap of scrap. It was dark and pitted and stained with dried blood that could never be washed off. A tech marine stood by the sword. He was a space marine who was also a mechanic, and he had a servo arm on his back. He told Voldus that the weapon was an anomaly. He explained that the iron had been bathed in so much warp energy from the creatures it had killed that it had developed a latent psychic field. It was not a demon weapon, because there was no demon trapped inside it. It was something else. It was a weapon that destroyed souls. The tech marine warned that the sword weighed over 400 pounds and that no human could lift it effectively in combat. He suggested melting it down. Guts walked past the tech marine and grabbed the handle of the Dragonslayer. The metal of the handle was wrapped in new leather because the old cloth had rotted away. Guts did not lift it with a struggle. He swung it up onto his shoulder in one fluid motion. The movement created a gust of wind that made the tech marine's robes flutter. The Grey Knights watched in silence. They knew the physics of muscle and bone, and they knew that what they just saw was impossible. Guts did not use psychic power to lift the sword. He used leverage and a lifetime of muscle memory that defied logic. Voldus ordered Guts to follow him to the training cages. They walked through the great halls of the fortress and past statues of heroes who had died thousands of years ago. Guts did not look at the statues. He looked at the shadows and checked for threats. He was hungry and he asked for food. A serf brought him a nutrient bar that tasted like chalk and grease. Guts ate it in 2 bites. He needed real meat, but the Grey Knights did not feast. They ate for function. The training cage was a large circular arena with a floor made of iron grids. Voldus stood on the observation deck looking down. He activated the training servitors. 3 combat servitors stepped out of the wall alcoves. They were cyborgs with blades for hands and no higher brain functions. They were programmed to kill. They moved with the speed of hydraulic pistons. Guts stood in the center of the ring and adjusted his grip on the sword. The brand on his neck began to itch, which meant the servitors were not the only threat. The warp was close here on Titan, because the Grey Knights constantly tested themselves against it. The first servitor lunged at Guts with a pair of chain blades. Guts did not dodge. He stepped into the attack and swung the flat of the Dragonslayer like a shield. The impact shattered the servitor's blades and sent the cyborg flying across the room, where it smashed into the wall and sparked. The second servitor tried to flank him. Guts spun around and the sword cleaved through the servitor's torso, cutting through metal and flesh and bone without slowing down. The top half of the machine fell to the floor, while the legs stood for a second before collapsing. The third servitor hesitated. It was a machine, but his logic cogitator could not calculate a winning trajectory. Guts did not wait. He closed the distance with a burst of speed that surprised even Voldus. Guts brought the sword down in an overhead smash that split the servitor down the middle. The fight was over in 10 seconds. Guts stood amidst the wreckage, and he was not breathing hard. He looked up at Voldus and waited for the next wave. Voldus was impressed, but he needed to know more. He needed to know if Guts could fight the things that were not made of metal. He pressed a rune on his control panel, and the safety fields in the arena lowered. He signaled a librarian to summon a minor warp entity. This was a dangerous practice, but necessary for training. A red portal opened in the air, and a bloodletter of Khorne stepped out. The demon was red and horned and carried a hellblade that glowed with black fire. It roared, and the sound caused fear in the hearts of normal men. Guts did not feel fear. He felt the familiar throb of the brand, and he smiled a terrible smile. The bloodletter sensed Guts and paused. Usually, demons see humans as prey, but this demon looked at Guts and saw a predator. The demon saw the aura of the Dragonslayer, and it recognized the scent of its own kind's blood. The demon charged. Guts charged. They met in the center of the arena with a clash that sounded like a thunderclap. The hellblade struck the Dragonslayer, and sparks of warp energy flew everywhere. The demon was faster and stronger than the servitors. It parried Guts' strike and slashed at his chest. The new armor held, but the claws tore deep grooves into the ceramite. Guts grunted and used his mechanical arm to grab the demon's horn. The demon was shocked by the physical contact. Guts pulled the demon's head down and headbutted it. The impact cracked the demon's skull. Then Guts brought the sword around in a low sweep and cut the demon's legs off at the knees. The creature fell and tried to crawl away. Guts walked over and placed the tip of the heavy sword on the demon's chest. He leaned his weight on it, and the blade crunched through the ribcage and pierced the heart. The demon dissolved into red mist and vanished back to the warp. Guts stood alone in the arena. The brand stopped bleeding. He looked up at Voldus again. The Grand Master activated the Vox speakers. He told Guts that the test was concluded. He told Guts that he was now a sanctioned asset of the Ordo Malleus. He would live in the barracks of the purgation squads. He would obey orders. And if he ever turned his blade against the Imperium, he would be destroyed. Guts sheathed the sword on his back and walked toward the exit. He did not salute. He just kept moving. That night, Guts sat in his cell, which was a stone room with no windows. He tried to sleep, but the nightmares came as they always did. He saw the eclipse and the faces of his dead friends. He saw the white hawk flying high above him. He woke up sweating and clutching his metal arm. The door to his cell opened and a small figure entered. It was not a soldier. It was a scribe, a human servant of the chapter who brought him water. The scribe looked at the giant warrior with fear. Guts took the water and drank. He looked at his hand. It was shaking, not from fear, but from the strain of holding back the beast of darkness that lived inside his mind. He knew that this place was just another battlefield. The enemies were different, but the struggle was the same. He was a struggler, and he would struggle until the last drop of blood was gone. Outside the cell, the Grey Knights prepared for war. A distress signal had come from the Cicatrix Maledictum. A planet was being consumed by the plague god Nurgle. Voldus reviewed the roster for the strike force. He added a new entry to the bottom of the list. He wrote Asset Guts and assigned him to the transport bay. The Grey Knights were going to war, and they were bringing their monster with them. The timeline of the galaxy had shifted slightly. A variable had been introduced that the Chaos Gods had not predicted. The man who kills dragons was now hunting demons in the stars. The strike cruiser Blade of Titan broke through the warp and entered real space above the Agri world of Hestia Prime. The planet used to be green and blue, and it fed 3 star systems with grain and meat. Now it was brown and yellow. From the viewing deck, Guts looked at the sphere, and he saw the sickness on a planetary scale. The clouds were thick with pollution, and the oceans were made of slime. Grand Master Voldus stood next to him and explained the situation. The Death Guard traitor Legion had infected the planet with a new strain of the Destroyer Plague. They were not just killing people. They were turning the planet into a garden for the plague god Nurgle. The goal of the mission was to teleport into the capital city and destroy the sorcerer who was maintaining the plague ritual. If they killed the sorcerer, the warp storm would fade, and the Navy could bomb the planet to dust. Guts checked the straps on his new armor. It was heavy ceramite, but it felt light compared to the burden of his memories. He touched the handle of the Dragonslayer. The tech priest had magnetized the back of his armor, so the sword stayed in place until he needed it. He did not like the plan. He did not like teleporting. He said it felt like falling into the mouth of a beast. Voldus told him that fear was a failure of duty. Guts grunted and said he was not afraid of duty. He was afraid of being scattered into atoms. The team gathered in the teleportarium chamber. There were 5 Grey Knights in the squad led by Justicar Khorne. They were Terminators wearing massive tactical dreadnought armor. Guts looked like a child standing next to them, even though he was a giant among normal men. The energy arcs began to spin around the platform. The air smelled of ozone. Guts closed his one eye and bit down on his tongue. The world dissolved in a flash of blue light. They materialized in the capital square of Hestia Prime. The transition was instant, but for Guts, it felt like an hour of screaming in the dark. He fell to his knees and retched bile onto the cobblestones. The Grey Knights stood perfectly still with their storm bolters raised. They were professionals who had done this 1,000 times. The square was a nightmare. The buildings were covered in a thick moss that pulsed like living flesh. The fountains ran with green pus, and the air was filled with flies the size of fists. The enemy was waiting. Hundreds of poxwalkers shambled toward them. These were the citizens of the city who had died and come back to life as rotting puppets. They groaned and their bodies were bloated with gas. Justicar Khorne gave the order to purge. The storm bolters roared. The sound was deafening. Explosive bolts tore through the crowd of zombies, blowing them apart in showers of rotten meat. The Grey Knights fired in controlled bursts, and they did not waste a single shot. Guts stood up and drew the Dragonslayer. The sound of the iron slab sliding off the magnetic lock was a heavy scrape that cut through the noise of the guns. A poxwalker lunged at him. Guts swung the sword horizontally. The blade hit the zombie and did not cut it. It obliterated it. The top half of the body vanished in a red mist, and the kinetic force knocked down the 3 zombies behind it. Guts stepped forward and swung again. He did not fight like a soldier. He fought like a natural disaster. He spun and chopped and crushed. The Grey Knights held their line, but Guts pushed forward into the horde. Khorne warned Guts over the Vox channel to hold position. Guts ignored him. The brand on his neck was bleeding, and the pain made him focus. He could feel the big monster. He knew where the sorcerer was. It was not in the cathedral. It was under the ground. He pointed with his metal hand at a large sewer grate in the center of the plaza. Khorne checked his Auspex scanner. The readings confirmed a massive psychic energy spike beneath them. The Justiciar was surprised that the humans sensed it before the machine did. They moved to the sewer entrance. The poxwalkers tried to stop them, but the wall of bolter fire and the swinging iron sword broke their morale. The squad descended into the dark. The sewers were wide tunnels made of ancient brick. The water was sludge. The smell was so bad that even the air filters in the helmet struggled to scrub it out. Guts did not have a helmet. He breathed the foul air and spat it out. His immune system was fighting the virus with every breath. They walked for a mile in the dark. The walls began to change. The brick was replaced by bone and the pipes were replaced by veins. They were entering a chaotic corruption of reality. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a massive underground cistern. In the center of the lake of slime stood the sorcerer. He was a plague marine of the Death Guard. He was huge and swollen with disease. His armor was rusted and cracked, and green smoke poured out of the vents. He held a staff topped with a skull that wept black oil. The sorcerer laughed. The sound was wet and bubbly. He slammed his staff into the ground. The liquid in the cistern rose up and formed into shapes. Beasts of Nurgle pulled themselves out of the slime. They were like giant slugs with tentacles and smiling faces. They wanted to play, but their play meant death. Khorne ordered the squad to engage. The Grey Knights charged. Their nemesis force halberds glowed with blue psychic fire. They cut into the beasts, and the psychic energy burned the demons' souls. But then the catastrophe happened. The sorcerer began to chant a word of power. It was a word from the dark tongue of Nurgle. The air in the cistern turned grey. A fog rolled in instantly. The blue fire on the Grey Knight's weapons flickered and died. Khorne shouted that the psychic link was severed. The fog was a null zone. It cut off the connection to the warp. The Grey Knights lost their foresight. They lost their psychic strength. They were now just men in heavy metal suits. The beasts of Nurgle surged forward. A beast grabbed Brother Alaric with a tentacle. Usually, Alaric would use his mind to blast the creature back, but he had no power. The beast squeezed. The ceramite armor groaned and cracked. Alaric screamed as the slime touched his skin. The acid melted his flesh instantly. The perfect formation of the Grey Knights collapsed. They were blind and deaf in the psychic spectrum. They hesitated. Guts did not hesitate. He did not rely on the warp. He did not use magic. He relied on iron and blood. He saw the Grey Knights falter, and he saw the opening. He roared, and the sound echoed in the chamber like a cannon shot. He charged straight at the sorcerer. The beast tried to block him. Guts swung the Dragonslayer. The sword did not need psychic power to kill. It was heavy and sharp, and it carried the weight of Guts's rage. He cut a beast of Nurgle in half from head to tail. The creature did not vanish because the null zone kept it anchored to reality. It just died a messy physical death. The sorcerer saw the human running across the bridge. He was confused. A human should be dead from the plague spores already. He raised his staff to cast a spell of rot, but the null zone he created to stop the Grey Knights also weakened his own magic. He had to rely on his physical strength. He drew a rusty plague knife. Guts reached him. Guts jumped into the air. He brought the sword down with all his weight. The sorcerer blocked with his staff. The staff was made of demon bone, but it was not strong enough. The Dragonslayer shattered the staff and crunched into the sorcerer's shoulder. The Plague Marine grunted and kicked Guts in the chest. The impact broke Guts's ribs. Guts flew back and landed in the mud. He rolled and came up standing. He coughed blood inside his mask. The brand was burning like a hot coal. The pain fueled him. He rushed in again. The sorcerer swung the plague knife. Guts caught the blade with his metal hand. The magnetic fingers clamped down on the rusty steel. The sorcerer tried to pull back, but Guts held on. With his right hand, Guts shortened his grip on the heavy sword and thrust it like a spear. The thick tip of the iron slab punched through the sorcerer's stomach and came out the back. Guts twisted the blade. The sorcerer screamed. Guts let go of the knife and used his metal hand to grab the cannon trigger on his arm. He placed the muzzle of the cannon against the sorcerer's helmetless face. He pulled the cord. The cannon fired. The explosion blew the sorcerer's head into fragments of bone and brain. The body fell into the slime. The ritual stopped. The fog lifted. The psychic connection returned. Khorne and the surviving Grey Knights felt the power of the Emperor rush back into their veins. They unleashed a storm of psychic lightning that incinerated the remaining beasts. But the damage was done. Brother Alaric was dead. His body was dissolving into a puddle of organic soup. Another knight, Brother Boreas, had his armor breached and was fighting off an infection in his leg. Guts stood over the headless body of the sorcerer. He was breathing hard. His new armor was covered in filth. He looked at Khorne. The Justicar looked back. There was no praise. There was only shock. The Grey Knights were the elite demon hunters. They were the ultimate weapon. But in the moment of crisis when their powers failed, they had been saved by a savage with a piece of iron. It was a strategic failure. The hierarchy of the squad was broken. They had survived, but they had lost their infallibility. They called for extraction. The teleportarium beacon locked onto their signal. As the blue light took them, Guts looked at the dead Grey Knight. He knew this feeling. He knew it well. It was the feeling that no matter how strong you are, the darkness will always take something from you. The mission was a success on paper. The target was destroyed, but the reality was a disaster. The Grey Knights had learned fear, and they had learned it from the man they were supposed to be watching. Back on the ship, the apothecaries rushed to treat Brother Boreas. They had to amputate his leg to stop the rot. Guts sat in the decontamination chamber. The chemical showers sprayed him with burning acid to kill the spores. He did not flinch. He scrubbed the blood off his metal hand. Voldus came to the viewing window. He looked at Guts. He did not see a tool anymore. He saw a variable that he could not control. The report stated that Guts had engaged a Death Guard champion in single combat and won without psychic aid. This was impossible for a baseline human. Voldus went to his private chambers and opened a secure channel to the Inquisition. He began to record a new log. He stated that Asset Guts was performing beyond projected parameters. He stated that the subject's resistance to Nurgle's rot was absolute, but he also added a warning. The subject fought with a brutality that disturbed the Battle Brothers. The Grey Knights fought to banish. Guts fought to kill. There was a difference, and that difference was dangerous. The fleet moved to the next coordinates. The campaign was just beginning, but the dynamic had shifted. The Grey Knights no longer looked at Guts with pity or arrogance. They looked at him with caution. They kept their distance in the mess hall. Guts ate his rations alone. He sharpened his sword with a whetstone. The sound of stone on iron echoed in the silence of the ship. Shing, shing, shing. It was the sound of a clock ticking down to the next catastrophe. The brand on his neck pulsed slowly. It was hungry, and the galaxy was full of food. The strike cruiser, Blade of Titan, moved through the warp like a silver needle stitching a wound. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was heavy with suspicion. The victory on Hestia Prime was recorded in the archives, but it was not celebrated. The Grey Knights are a brotherhood of secrets, and they value purity above all else. To rely on a blunt instrument like the human called Guts was seen as a failure of their sacred doctrine. Chaplain Durendin called a council of war in the strategy room. The room was dark and lit only by the green glow of the tactical table. Durendin was a terrifying figure in black power armor with a skull helmet. He was responsible for the spiritual health of the warriors. He played the footage of Guts killing the Nurgle sorcerer. He pointed a metal finger at the screen. He said that the human fought with hate and not with faith. He said that hate is the fuel of Khorne the Blood God. He argued that keeping Guts alive was a risk that outweighed his tactical value. Grand Master Voldus listened with a stone face. He knew the chaplain was right according to the Codex. But Voldus was a pragmatist. He saw a galaxy that was breaking apart. The Great Rift had split the Imperium in two. Resources were gone. Reinforcements were impossible. They needed every weapon they could find. Voldus told the chaplain that the subject would remain in stasis between missions. He ordered that Guts be locked in a null chamber. This was a cell lined with blackstone that cut off all connection to the warp. It was usually used to hold demons before banishment. Now it would hold their new soldier. Deep in the bowels of the ship, Guts sat, in the dark. The null chamber was silent. The constant itching of the brand on his neck stopped for the first time in years. The Blackstone absorbed the psychic signal. It was the first peace he had felt since the eclipse. But it was a cold peace. He sat on the floor with his metal legs crossed. He cleaned the Dragonslayer with a rag and oil. The sword was dull and chipped from the battle with the sorcerer. He used a file to smooth the edge. The sound of metal on metal was the only thing that proved he was still alive. He thought about the White Hawk. He thought about the dream he had. The beast of darkness was quiet now, but he knew it was waiting. He knew the Grey Knights were afraid of him. He did not blame them. He was afraid of himself sometimes. The ship's alarm screamed. The sound was a low thrum that vibrated the deck plates. The ship dropped out of the warp into real space. The transition was rough. Gravity fluctuated and threw loose objects across the room. Guts stood up and strapped the sword to his back. The door to his cell hissed open. A squad of paladins stood there. They were the elite bodyguards of the Grand Master. They did not speak. They gestured for him to follow. They walked him to the drop pod bay. They did not give him a briefing. They treated him like a dangerous animal being moved to a new cage. The mission was on the forge world of Ferox. It was a planet of metal and fire, where the Adeptus Mechanicus built tanks for the Imperial Guard. A distress signal had been screaming for 3 days. The message was simple. Blood. Blood for the Blood God. The World Eater's traitor legion had arrived. They were the sons of Angron and they lived only to kill. They did not use strategy. They used mass slaughter. They had broken the planetary defense grid and were butchering the tech priests into the manufactorums. The Grey Knights were deploying to save the Titan databanks deep underground. Volder spoke over the Vox network. He ordered the strike force to teleport directly into the central plaza of the Manufactorum complex. He gave a specific order regarding asset Guts. Guts was not to be deployed with the main force. He was to be held in a drop pod in orbit. He was the reserve option, the last resort. Voldus did not want to unleash a berserker against an army of berserkers unless it was absolutely necessary. He feared that the resonance of rage would be too strong. He feared that Guts would fall to Khorne the moment he saw the red armor of the enemy. The Grey Knights teleported down. The flash of blue light illuminated a scene of absolute horror. The factory floor was 5 miles wide and covered in machinery. The World Eaters were everywhere. They wore red power armor with brass trim. Their helmets had bunny ear crests that were actually sensory arrays for detecting fear. They wielded chain axes that roared like engines. They were killing the servitors and the priests and piling the skulls in great pyramids. When the Grey Knights appeared, the World Eaters did not panic. They cheered. They wanted a real fight. The battle began instantly. The Grey Knights fired their storm bolters and the air filled with exploding shells. The World Eaters charged through the fire. They did not care about casualties. If a traitor died, his brothers would climb over his body to reach the enemy. The Grey Knights used their nemesis force weapons. They channeled their psychic power into the blades to cut through the ceramite armor of the traitors, but there was a problem. The World Eaters had brought their own support. Huge brass machines walked among the traitors. They were engines of Khorne. They looked like scorpion tanks with demonic faces. These machines projected a field of anti-psychic static. The Grey Knights felt their powers weaken. Their force weapons lost their blue glow. Their precognition failed. They were suddenly blind to the future. They had to fight on physical skill alone. And in a physical fight, the World Eaters were superior. The traitors were pumped full of combat drugs and possessed by minor demons of rage. They were faster and stronger than the Loyalists. Justicar Thorne radioed Voldus. He reported that the squad was being pushed back. He reported that the psychic dampening field was too strong to break. They were losing brothers. A World Eater champion with a two-handed chain axe smashed through the Grey Knight line. He decapitated Brother Nero in a single swing. The line broke. The Grey Knights formed a defensive circle, but they were being buried under a tide of red armor. The mission was failing. The Titan databanks were at risk of being destroyed. Voldus watched the tactical display from the command bridge. He saw the red dots overwhelming the blue dots. He had no choice. He looked at the tech priest manning the launch console. He gave the order. Launch the asset. In the orbit above the drop pod shot out of the launch tube. It streaked down through the atmosphere burning orange and red. Inside the pod, Guts stood in the harness. He felt the heat. He felt the G-force crushing him. He began to smile. The brand on his neck started to bleed profusely. It reacted to the presence of the Khorne worshippers below. The pain was sharp and hot. It felt like a hook pulling him downward. The drop pod crashed through the roof of the manufactorum. It slammed into the factory floor with the force of a meteorite. The impact created a shockwave that knocked down the World Eaters and the Grey Knights alike. Dust and smoke filled the air. The doors of the pod exploded outward. Guts stepped out. The World Eaters stopped their attack. They smelled something. They smelled fresh blood. But more than that, they smelled a soul that was burning with a rage that matched their own. They looked at the human. He was small compared to them. He wore grey scout armor and had a metal arm. But the sword he carried was huge. It was a slab of iron that shouldn't exist. A World Eater. Berserker laughed. He revved his chain axe and charged at Guts. He shouted, "Blood for the blood god." Guts did not shout. He gritted his teeth. He swung the Dragonslayer. The iron blade hit the chain axe. The chain axe shattered. The sword continued its arc and hit the Berserker. The traitor Marine was cut in half at the waist. The top half spun in the air. The bottom half fell down. The World Eaters went quiet for a second. Then they roared. They recognized a worthy tribute to their god. 10 of them charged Guts at once. This was the moment Voldus feared. This was the moment Guts would lose control. And he did, but not in the way the Grey Knights expected. Guts did not pray to Khorne. He did not ask for strength. He just let go of the leash he kept on his own beast. Guts moved like a whirlwind of black iron. He spun and chopped. The Dragonslayer had mass. When it hit a Space Marine, it didn't just cut. It crushed. It turned ceramite armor into shrapnel. It turned superhuman bone into dust. Guts used the momentum of the sword to pull himself around. He used his metal hand to punch through helmets. He fired the cannon in his arm at point-blank range, blasting holes in chests. He was not fighting with martial arts. He was fighting with industrial violence. The Grey Knights watched in stunned silence. They saw a human man dismantling Astartes warriors like they were toys. The anti-psychic field that crippled the Grey Knights did not affect Guts because he had no psychic power to dampen. He was purely physical. He was the perfect counter to the Khorne strategy. The World Eaters forgot about the Grey Knights. They forgot about the databanks. They only wanted to kill the man with the big sword. They swarmed him like ants on a beetle. Guts was buried under a pile of red armor. Voldus thought he was dead. Then the pile exploded. Guts rose up. His armor was cracked. His face was a mask of blood. He had taken wounds that would kill a normal man 3 times over, but he was still moving. His eye was wide and white. He was in the berserker state. He swung the sword again and again. Then the champion of the World Eaters stepped forward. He was a lord of Khorne named Kargos the Butcher. He stood 8 feet tall in Terminator armor adorned with skulls. He wielded a demon weapon that burned with red fire. He pointed his weapon at Guts. He challenged him. Guts did not answer. He just breathed. A cloud of steam came from his mouth. Kargos charged. He moved with unnatural speed. He swung his demon weapon. Guts blocked with the Dragonslayer. The impact cracked the floor plates. The demon weapon screamed. It tried to bite into the iron of Guts' sword, but the Dragonslayer was soaked in the blood of stronger things than this. Guts pushed back. He was stronger than the Terminator. It defied physics. It defied biology. It was the strength of a man who refused to die. Guts kicked Kargos in the knee. The joint locked. Guts headbutted the Chaos Lord. The sound was like a hammer hitting an anvil. Kargos stumbled back. Guts grabbed the handle of his sword with both hands. He lifted it high. He brought it down. Kargos tried to block with his weapon. The Dragonslayer cut through the demon weapon. It cut through the Terminator armor. It cut through the helmet. It cut Kargos in two down the middle. The death of the leader broke the focus of the World Eaters. They were confused. Their god had favored the human, not them. The Grey Knight seized the moment. The anti-psychic field faltered as the engines of Khorne were confused by the loss of command. The Grey Knights charged back into the fray. Their force weapons ignited again. They slaughtered the remaining traitors, who were still staring at Guts. The battle ended quickly after that. The World Eaters retreated or were hunted down. The factory floor was a lake of blood. The Grey Knights regrouped. They secured the databanks. The mission was a success, but the danger was not over. Guts stood in the center of the carnage. He was not stopping. He was breathing in ragged gasps. He turned around. He looked at the Grey Knights. His single eye was still white. He did not see allies. He saw shapes. He saw movement. He took a step toward Justicar Khorne. He raised the sword. "Hold fire!" Khorne shouted to his squad. The Grey Knights raised their storm bolters. They aimed at Guts. They were ready to put him down. This was the moment the Inquisition had warned about. The weapon had turned. "Guts!" Voldus's voice boomed over the external speakers of the dropship that was descending. "Stand down." Guts twitched. The name meant something. He stopped. He shook his head like a wet dog. The white faded from his eye. The pupil returned. He blinked. He looked at the sword in his hand. He looked at the Grey Knights pointing guns at him. He understood. He lowered the sword. He fell to his knees. The adrenaline crashed. The pain returned. He coughed, and blood poured from his mouth. Voldus landed and walked up to him. He looked at the dead Chaos Lord. He looked at Guts. Voldus realized that they had won a great victory, but they had lost something else. They had lost the moral high ground. They had used a monster to kill monsters, and the monster was getting stronger. The apothecaries rushed in to stabilize Guts. They injected him with stims and clotting agents. They dragged him back to the dropship. Guts did not resist. He was too tired. He looked at the sky. The smoke was clearing. He saw the stars. He wondered if they were the same stars he saw back home. He didn't think so. These stars were cold. Back on the ship, the mood was grim. The report went to the High Lords of Terror. It was redacted. The official record stated that the Grey Knights had purged the planet. Guts was not mentioned. He did not exist. He was a ghost. In the armory, a tech marine examined the Dragonslayer. He ran a scanner over the blade. He found something new. The sword had absorbed the essence of the Chaos Lord's demon weapon. The iron was darker now. It had a faint red sheen. The tech marine stepped back in fear. The sword was evolving. It was drinking the war. Voldus sat in his chamber. He held a data slate. It was a message from a contact in the Ordo Hereticus. The Inquisition had heard rumors. They were asking questions about a human auxiliary with a large sword. Voldus deleted the message. He knew the clock was ticking. Guts was a secret they could not keep forever, and when the secret came out, the war would not be against chaos. It would be against the Imperium itself. Guts slept in his cell. He dreamed of fire. He dreamed of a man in white armor who looked like a hawk. But the hawk was not saving him. The hawk was laughing. Guts woke up and punched the wall. The stone cracked. He was still here. He was still fighting. And he was still angry. The next battle would be worse. He could feel it. The brand was not just an open wound anymore. It was a map, and it was leading him somewhere dark. On the bridge, the navigator reported a new anomaly. A warp rift had opened in the neighboring system. It was not a random storm. It was a precise tear in reality. Something was coming through. Something that knew Guts was there. The God Hand had found their struggler, and they were sending an invitation. The fleet of the Grey Knights entered the orbit of the shrine world called Sanctus Lys. The planet was a jewel of the ecclesiarchy, and it was covered in white marble cities and golden cathedrals that could be seen from space. The atmosphere was calm, and the vox channels were filled with choirs singing hymns to the Emperor. There was no distress signal, and there was no sign of invasion. The sensors of the strike cruiser Blade of Titan showed peace, but Grandmaster Voldus felt a cold sweat on his forehead. The psychic choir of the Grey Knights reported a sense of unease that they could not explain. It was not the presence of demons, but the absence of them. The warp was too quiet. It was like the silence of a deep ocean before a tsunami. Guts stood in the launch bay, and he was not looking at the view screen. He was clutching his neck. The brand of sacrifice was bleeding faster than it ever had before. The blood ran down his collar and soaked into his grey fatigues. He fell to his knees and vomited bile. The pain was not sharp. It was a heavy, crushing weight that felt like gravity had increased 10 times. He told the apothecary that something was down there. He said it was not a monster. He said it was an eclipse. The apothecary checked his vitals and found his heart rate was fatal, but Guts was still standing. Voldus came to the bay. He looked at the suffering man. He had a choice. The scanner said the planet was safe. The man said the planet was a trap. Imperial logic dictated that machines and psychers were more reliable than a mutant human. But Voldus had seen Guts fight. He trusted the pain more than the peace. Voldus ordered a full combat drop. He did not send a diplomatic envoy. He sent 5 squads of Terminators and a Dreadknight. He ordered Guts to be strapped into a restraint harness in his personal Stormraven gunship. The other captains questioned the order. They asked why they were deploying for war against a loyal world. Voldus told them to trust in the Emperor and keep their bolters loaded. The gunships descended through the white clouds. They flew over miles of statues and gardens. The people of Sanctus Lys looked up and cheered. They thought the angels of the Emperor had come to bless them. They threw flowers into the air. The strike force landed in the Plaza of the Ascendant. It was a vast open space paved with gold and silver. In the center stood a massive temple with doors made of pearl. A procession of priests came out to meet them. They were led by a figure who radiated light. He was tall and beautiful, with long silver hair and armor that looked like glass. He called himself Saint Karas. He smiled, and the Grey Knights felt a wave of peace wash over their minds. Their psychic senses told them that this man was pure. He was a living saint blessed by the Golden Throne. Justicar Thorn lowered his weapon. He felt shame for coming here with guns. He bowed his head. Guts did not bow. The moment the ramp of the gunship opened, he screamed. It was a sound of pure animal agony. He tore through the restraint harness. The leather strap snapped. He stumbled down the ramp and fell onto the gold pavement. He looked at Sincaris. Guts did not see a beautiful man. His right eye saw the physical reality, which was a man. But his left eye socket, which was empty, throbbed with the vision of the interstice. He saw the truth. He saw a hole in reality shaped like a man. He saw a vortex of souls screaming in silence. He saw the hawk. Voldus stepped forward to greet the saint. Karis opened his arms. He spoke with a voice that sounded like music. He said he had been waiting for the Grey Knights. He said he had a gift for them. He said he could end their long war. He said he could make the demons go away forever. All they had to do was kneel and accept his blessing. The offer was tempting. The Grey Knights were tired. They had fought for 10,000 years. The idea of peace was a drug. A few of the battle brothers began to kneel. The psychic pressure was subtle. It was not a force. It was a seduction. It bypassed their mental shields because it did not feel like an attack. It felt like salvation. Guts stood up. He drew the Dragonslayer. The sound of the iron scraping the sheath was loud and ugly in the quiet plaza. The priest gasped. The Grey Knights turned and saw Guts walking toward the saint. His teeth were bared and he was foaming at the mouth. He looked like a madman attacking a god. Khorne shouted for Guts to halt. He aimed his stormbolter at Guts. He warned him that heresy would be punished by death. Guts did not hear him. All he heard was the blood rushing in his ears. He broke into a run. The small choice happened in a fraction of a second. Voldus saw his men aiming at Guts. He saw the saint smiling, and he saw the shadow of the saint. The sun was directly overhead, but the shadow of St. Karis did not match his body. The shadow was not human. It was a winged thing with a beak. It was a small detail, a trick of the light, or a slip in the illusion. Voldus looked at Guts. Guts was a monster, but he was an honest monster. He never hid his nature. Karis was hiding everything. Voldus made his decision. He did not fire at Guts. He shouted a command word that overrode the targeting systems of his squad's armor. "Hold," Voldus shouted. The delay was enough. Guts reached the saint. Karis did not move. He looked at Guts with pity. He raised a hand to stop the sword. He thought his psychic shield would hold. He was wrong. The Dragonslayer was not a normal weapon. It existed partially in the astral plane. It carried the weight of 1,000 dead apostles. Guts swung the sword with every ounce of his hatred. The iron slab hit the saint's hand. The hand exploded. The force of the blow continued down and smashed into the saint's shoulder. Karis screamed. The sound was not music. It was the shriek of a vulture. The illusion broke. The beautiful glass armor shattered and revealed the black carapace underneath. The silver hair fell away and revealed a helmet of bone shaped like a bird of prey. The golden skin melted and showed grey dead flesh. St. Karis was not a human. He was a demon prince of Tzeentch who had worn a mask of holiness. The wave of peace vanished and was replaced by a wave of terror. The sky turned purple. The golden pavement cracked and bled. The priests who were chanting mutated instantly into horrors of pink and blue fire. The Grey Knights were stunned. Their minds reeled from the psychic backlash. They had almost knelt to a demon. They had almost damned themselves. The shame turned instantly to fury. Khorne roared and opened fire. The stormbolters lit up the plaza. The horrors screamed as the explosive bolts tore them apart. But the demon prince was huge now. He grew to the size of a building. He had wings that blotted out the sun. He looked down at Guts. "Struggler," the demon said, "you are far from your destiny." Guts did not talk. He jumped. He used the flat of his sword to block a talon the size of a spear. The impact drove him into the ground. He coughed blood. The demon laughed and unleashed a storm of warp lightning. The lightning hit the Grey Knights. It cooked them inside their armor. Brother Solon died instantly as his soul was ripped from his body. The Dread Knight pilot was fused to his machine. The battle was a catastrophe. The Grey Knights were fighting a god on his own ground. Voldus rallied his men. He began to chant the rite of banishment. He focused his mind to cut the demon's anchor to reality, but the demon was too strong. It had been feeding on the faith of this planet for centuries. Every prayer to the Emperor had been twisted into food for the warp. The demon waved its hand and Voldus was thrown across the plaza. He hit a pillar, and his Terminator armor cracked. He tried to stand, but his legs were paralyzed. Guts was the only one left in the kill zone. He was fighting the demon alone. He was small, and the enemy was a giant. It looked impossible. But Guts had fought giants before. He knew that big things were slow. He rolled under the demon's legs. He swung his sword at the ankle. The iron bit deep into the demon flesh. The creature howled. Guts didn't stop. He activated the cannon in his arm. He fired a hook shot that wrapped a chain around the demon's other leg. He pulled. It wasn't enough to trip the giant, but it was enough to make it stumble. The demon looked down with annoyance. It tried to step on the insect. Guts dodged, but he was getting tired. The brand was burning him alive. He could feel his own blood boiling. He needed an opening. He needed the Grey Knights to do their job. He looked at Voldus. The Grand Master was on the ground. Guts shouted at him. He shouted in low Gothic, "Get up. Do your magic. I can't kill it alone." Voldus heard the man. He felt the shame of weakness. He forced his mind to focus. He could not move his body, but his mind was a weapon. He reached out with his psychic power. He did not try to banish the demon. He did not try to attack it. Instead, he reached out to Guts. He found the man's mind. It was a chaotic storm of rage and trauma. Voldus injected a single thought into Guts' brain. It was a word of power. Sanctic. Guts felt a surge of cold fire in his veins. The Grey Knight had buffed him. For a moment the pain of the brand faded. Guts felt lighter. He roared and the sound had a psychic echo. He jumped again. This time he jumped higher than humanly possible. He landed on the demon's knee. He ran up the thigh. The demon tried to swat him. Guts ducked, and the talon missed him by an inch. He reached the chest. He stabbed the Dragonslayer into the demon's ribs. He used it as a ladder step. He vaulted up to the neck. The demon's face was right there. The bird-like mask stared at him. Guts smiled. It was a savage smile. He pulled the cannon cord. The explosion blew the demon's mask off. Underneath was a swirling vortex of light. Guts swung the sword. He put his back into it. He put his life into it. The sword sliced through the neck. The head of the demon did not fall. It dissolved. The body collapsed into a pile of black sludge. The psychic storm ended. The sky returned to blue. The monsters vanished. The silence returned. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a graveyard. Guts fell from the corpse and landed hard. He did not get up. He lay on his back, breathing shallow breaths. His armor was gone from the waist up. His chest was a ruin of scars and fresh burns. Voldus dragged himself over. The apothecaries were already attending to the wounded. Voldus looked at Guts. He saw the brand. It had stopped bleeding. Voldus realized the truth. The brand was a radar. It was the only thing that had saved them. The Grey Knights, the supposed masters of demon hunting, had been blind. A human had led them. This was a theological nightmare. If the Inquisition found out that a mutant had saved a Grey Knight Grand Master, it would be the end of the chapter's reputation. But the nightmare was just beginning. The Vox operator on the gunship screamed a warning. A new ship had entered the system. It was not a demon ship. It was worse. It was a black ship. It was the Fortress of Judgment, the flagship of Inquisitor Lord Torquemada Coteaz, the High Protector of the Formosa sector. He had arrived to investigate the silence of the Shrine world. The black ship descended like a hammer. It was huge and covered in guns. It broadcast a demand for immediate submission. Voldus looked at his squad. They were battered. They were weak. And they had a heretic lying in their midst. Voldus ordered his men to stand up. He ordered the apothecaries to hide Guts in the back of the transport. They refused. They said Guts needed surgery or he would die. Voldus grabbed the apothecary by the gorget. He told him to stabilize the man and cover him with a tarp. He said Guts was dead equipment. The Inquisitor landed. Coteaz was a giant of a man in gold power armor. He carried a massive demon hammer and was accompanied by a retinue of scribes, cyborgs, and stormtroopers. He walked through the ruined plaza. He saw the black sludge. He saw the dead grey knights. He looked at Voldus. "Grand Master," Coteaz said. His voice was cold iron. "Explain this. Why is a holy world covered in the filth of the warp? And why did my psychers sense a non-sanctioned entity fighting alongside you?" Voldus stood tall despite his injuries. He lied. He said they had found a demon infestation and purged it. He said the entity was a manifestation of the enemy. Coteaz did not look convinced. He was a man who burned planets on suspicion alone. He walked toward the transport where Guts was hidden. He had a cyber eagle on his shoulder that scanned for lies. The eagle screeched. Coteaz stopped. He pointed his hammer at the transport. "Open it." Voldus stepped in front of the Inquisitor. "That is chapter property, Lord Coteaz. It contains the bodies of my fallen brothers. You have no jurisdiction over the dead of Titan. I have jurisdiction over everything that breathes in the Emperor's domain," Coteaz replied. "Move, or be moved." The stormtroopers raised their hell guns. The surviving Grey Knights raised their storm bolters. It was a standoff, a civil war in the middle of a holy square. Voldus knew he could kill Coteaz, but he knew that doing so would make the Grey Knights traitors. The entire Imperium would hunt them. But if he let Coteaz take Guts, the man would be dissected. They would find the brand. They would find the connection to the deep warp. And they would realize that Guts was a magnet for the things that kill worlds. Suddenly, a groan came from the transport. Guts kicked the tarp off. He stood up. He was half naked and covered in black blood. He dragged the Dragonslayer behind him. He walked out into the light. He looked at Coteaz. He looked at the hammer. He looked at the golden armor. "Another one," Guts muttered. "More shiny armor. More talk." Coteaz looked at the man. He saw the metal arm. He saw the missing eye. And he felt the aura. It was not the aura of a psyker. It was the aura of a man who had walked through hell and eaten the fire. Coteaz's eagle screamed and flew away in terror. "What is this abomination?" Coteaz asked. "He is a weapon," Voldus said quickly. "A sanctioned Xenos hunter. He is under my command." "He stinks of the warp," Coteaz said. "He bears a mark. I can see it pulsing." Coteaz stepped closer. "He is a conduit, a witch. He must be purified." Coteaz raised his hammer. He intended to crush Guts' skull right there. Guts did not flinch. He tightened his grip on his sword. He was ready to fight the Inquisition. He was ready to fight the whole world. "Touch him," Voldus said softly, "and I will tear this planet in half." The threat hung in the air. It was absolute. Voldus, a Grand Master of the Grey Knights, was threatening a High Lord of the Inquisition over a single human life. It was madness. It was heresy. But Voldus had seen the truth. The demon prince had called Guts struggler. The enemy feared him, and the enemy did not fear the Inquisition. The enemy did not fear the Grey Knights anymore. They feared the man with the iron sword. Coteaz lowered his hammer slowly. He was a politician as well as a warrior. He calculated the odds. A fight here would destroy his retinue, and he needed the Grey Knights for the coming crusade. He narrowed his eyes. "Very well," Coteaz said. "You claim he is a weapon. Then he belongs to the state. I am requisitioning this asset. He will come with me to the Black Ship. We will test him. If he is pure, he serves. If he is corrupt, he burns. He stays with me," Voldus said. "Then you are declared excommunicate traitoris," Coteaz said. He reached for his rosette. Voldus looked at Guts. Guts looked back. There was a moment of understanding. Guts knew that if he stayed, he would cause a war that would kill the only people who had given him a chance. He didn't care about the politics, but he cared about the fight, and the fight was bigger than this square. Guts stepped forward. He spat blood on the golden boots of the Inquisitor. "I'll go," Guts said. "Your ship has food." Coteaz was surprised by the insolence. "It has cells." "Good enough," Guts said. He looked at Voldus. "Don't worry. I've been in worse places." Voldus wanted to stop him, but he knew this was the only way to avoid the destruction of his brotherhood. He nodded. "We will come for you." "Don't bother," Guts said. "Just point me to the next monster." The stormtroopers surrounded Guts. They shackled his hands and legs. They tried to take his sword. Guts growled low in his throat. Coteaz waved his hand. "Let him keep the scrap metal. It will be evidence." They marched Guts away. The ramp of the Black Ship closed. The heavy engines fired. The ship rose into the sky and left the atmosphere. Voldus stood alone in the plaza. He had won the battle, but he had lost the war for his soul. He had surrendered a man to the torture chambers of the Inquisition. But on the Black Ship, Guts was not afraid. He sat in the dark cell of the brig. He felt the ship enter the warp. The shadows in the corner of the cell began to move. Small demons whispered to him. They told him he was going to die. They told him his soul belonged to the vortex. Guts laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "You're locked in here with me," Guts whispered to the shadows. He leaned back against the cold wall. The brand bled a little. He closed his eye. He knew the God hand was watching. He knew this was part of the flow of causality. But he was the fish that jumped out of the river. The Inquisition thought they had captured a prisoner. They were wrong. They had just invited the wolf into the sheep pen. And the wolf was hungry. The sound of the Black Ship's Geller field generator groaning under the pressure. The journey to Terra would be long, and in the warp time means nothing. The stage was set for the final convergence. The struggle was moving to the heart of the Imperium itself. The Black Ship Fortress of Judgment moved through the currents of the warp, and it was not a smooth journey. The ship was a massive dungeon that carried thousands of psychers to Holy Terra to be fed to the Golden Throne. The air inside smelled of incense and fear. Deep in the interrogation deck, Guts hung from chains made of cold iron. He was stripped to the waist, and his body was a map of scars that told the history of 1,000 battles. Inquisitor Lord Coteaz stood before him, holding a heated rod. Coteaz was a man of absolute will who believed that pain was the key to truth. He had been torturing Guts for 3 days. He wanted to know the name of the demon that marked him. He wanted to know why the man's soul felt like a black hole. Guts did not scream. He had felt pain that went beyond the physical nerve endings. He had felt his soul being torn apart during the eclipse. The hot iron on his skin was annoying, but it was not true suffering. Guts looked at the Inquisitor with his one good eye, and the eye was dull and flat. He told Coteaz that he was wasting his time. He said the answers were not in his head. They were in the dark outside the ship. Coteaz did not like this answer. He signaled the chirurgeon to increase the voltage on the neural flails. The electricity arced into Guts' muscles and made them spasm violently. Guts gritted his teeth until one of them cracked, but he did not speak. The brand of sacrifice on his neck began to pulse. It was not the slow throb of a distant warning. It was a rapid beat, like a panic drum. Blood trickled down his neck and hissed on the hot floor. Coteaz stopped. He looked at the mark. He had seen many cursed sigils in his life, but this one was different. It did not belong to Khorne or Nurgle or Tzeentch or Slaanesh. It felt older. It felt like a fundamental law of the universe that had been broken. Coteaz checked his Auspex scanner. The psychic readings in the room were spiking. The ship was deep in the immaterium, and the walls of reality were thin. The red alert klaxons began to howl. The sound was deafening. A voice came over the Voxcaster screaming that the Geller field was fluctuating. The Geller field is the bubble of reality that protects ships from the warp. If it fails, the ship becomes part of the demon world. Coteaz dropped the torture instruments. He grabbed his demon hammer. He knew that a fluctuation on a black ship was the worst possible scenario. The hold was full of untrained psychers. If the field weakened, their minds would become open doors for the entities outside. The door to the interrogation cell blew open. It was not opened by a man. It was blown off its hinges by a wave of telekinetic force. A stormtrooper flew into the room and smashed against the back wall. His armor was crushed like a tin can. Behind him in the corridor, the shadows were moving. They were not shadows. They were creatures made of teeth and oil. They were lesser demons pouring through the cracks in the ship's hull. Coteaz swung his hammer and smashed the nearest creature into mist. He ordered his retinue to form a defensive line. Guts pulled on the chains. The electricity had weakened him, but the adrenaline was waking him up. He saw the monsters. He felt the familiar itch in his blood. He looked at Coteaz and shouted. He told the Inquisitor to let him down. Coteaz ignored him. The Inquisitor was busy crushing skulls, but the demons were endless. They were small, but they were swarming. They crawled on the ceiling and the floor. They ate the face of a scribe. They pulled the chirurgeon into the dark. Then the ship shook violently. The main containment hold had breached. 5,000 psychers screamed at once, and the sound was a psychic shockwave that knocked everyone to the ground. The lights went out. The emergency red lighting flickered on. In the red gloom, Guts saw a shape materialize. It was not a random demon. It was an apostle. It looked like a giant slug with the face of a human woman. It squeezed through the corridor, crushing the metal bulkheads. It laughed, and the sound caused madness. Coteaz fired his wrist-mounted bolter. The explosive shells hit the apostle's skin and bounced off. The creature was too thick. It spat a stream of acid that melted 3 stormtroopers instantly. Coteaz realized he was going to die. His hammer was powerful, but he was surrounded. He looked at Guts. The prisoner was the only one not screaming. The prisoner was staring at the apostle with a look of pure murder. Coteaz made a calculation. He was a pragmatist. A heretic weapon is better than no weapon. Coteaz ran to the war console. He punched in the release code. The iron cuffs on Guts' wrists unlocked with a heavy clank. Guts fell to the floor. He did not waste time rubbing his wrists. He rolled forward and grabbed the Dragonslayer, which had been confiscated, and leaned against the wall. The moment his hand touched the leather grip, the sword seemed to hum. It knew its master. Guts stood up. He was half naked and bleeding and exhausted, but he looked bigger than the armored stormtroopers. The apostle lunged at Coteaz. The Inquisitor raised his hammer to block, but the creature was too fast. Then a black blur intercepted the attack. Guts swung the Dragonslayer. The sound of the impact was like a car crash. The iron slab hit the apostle in the mouth. Teeth the size of daggers flew across the room. The creature reeled back. Guts did not stop. He stepped in. He pivoted his hips and swung again. The sword cut through the thick blubber of the monster's neck. Black blood sprayed everywhere, covering Guts and Coteaz. The head of the apostle fell off. The body thrashed and died. Guts stood on the corpse. He breathed hard. He looked at Coteaz. The Inquisitor looked back. There was no gratitude in Coteaz's eyes, only calculation. He saw that the brand on Guts's neck was glowing so bright it burned the air. Guts was a lighthouse in the dark. The demons were not attacking the ship randomly. They were coming for him. Coteaz spoke quickly. He said the ship was being boarded by a coherent force. He said the brand was drawing them in. He said Guts had to help clear the engine room, or they would all be digested for eternity. Guts spat a glob of blood on the floor. He said he didn't care about the ship, but he wasn't done killing yet. It was a temporary alliance born of desperation. They moved into the corridor. It was a slaughterhouse. The crew was dead or mutating. The walls were covered in flesh that had grown out of the steel. They fought their way toward the lower decks. Coteaz led with his hammer, smashing the smaller entities. Guts followed with his sword, clearing the path of the larger beasts. They were a devastating team. Coteaz used his psychic powers to banish the demons' souls, while Guts used his physical rage to destroy their bodies. They covered each other's blind spots. When a demon tried to flank Guts, Coteaz blasted it with psychic lightning. When a heavy beast pinned Coteaz, Guts cut it in half. They reached the elevator to the engine deck. The shaft was broken. They had to jump down. They landed on the roof of the elevator car 3 floors down. The impact shook their bones. The engine room doors were buckled. Inside was the heart of the ship, where the Geller field generator was located. It was a massive machine the size of a cathedral, but it was infested. A greater daemon stood atop the generator. It was not a creature of the Chaos Gods. It was something from Guts' past. It was a servant of the God Hand. It looked like a centaur made of bone and fire. It held a lance of warp energy. It was smashing the generator coils. It wanted to drop the field completely and drag the ship into the deep layers of the astral plane where the God Hand waited. The creature saw Guts. It spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding stones. It called him the struggler. It said the hawk was waiting for him. It said resistance was part of the flow of causality, but the end was inevitable. Guts did not listen to speeches. He roared. It was the roar of a man who had lost everything and found only anger. He charged across the catwalk. The centaur laughed and thrust its lance. The beam of energy vaporized the metal railing. Guts slid underneath the beam. He was moving on instinct. His metal arm clicked and whirred. He got close and swung the sword upward. The centaur blocked with a shield made of souls. The Dragonslayer hit the shield and sparks of white light exploded. The force of the blow cracked the catwalk. Guts fell through to the deck below. Coteaz engaged the beast from above. He flew on his psychic power. He slammed his hammer onto the creature's back. The demon screamed but did not fall. It swatted Coteaz out of the air like a fly. The Inquisitor hit the wall and slid down. His golden armor was crushed. His ribs were broken. He tried to stand, but he coughed blood. He was finished. The daemon raised its lance to finish the High Lord of the Inquisition. Guts climbed back up. He used the machinery as a ladder. He saw Coteaz dying. He didn't care about the man, but he needed the ship, and he needed to kill the beast. He activated the cannon in his arm. He didn't have a clear shot at the head. He aimed for the generator coil directly above the demon. He pulled the cord. The cannon fired. The explosive shell hit the coolant pipe. Liquid nitrogen sprayed out at high pressure. It hit the demon. The creature's fire was extinguished instantly. Its bone armor froze and became brittle. The demon roared in confusion. It was stuck in the ice. Guts jumped. He jumped from the high gantry. He fell like a meteor. He held the sword point down. He put all his weight and all his hate into the drop. The tip of the Dragonslayer hit the frozen spine of the demon. The ice shattered. The iron plunged deep into the creature's body. Guts landed on the demon's back and drove the sword down until the hilt touched the bone. The demon shrieked. It was a sound that broke the glass in the control room. The creature tried to reach back and grab Guts. Guts let go of the sword and grabbed the demon's horns with his metal hand. He pulled the head back. He pulled until the neck snapped. The creature dissolved into black smoke. The heavy presence lifted. The Geller field generator groaned and sparked. The tech priests who were hiding in the control bunker rushed out. They engaged the emergency restart rights. The machine hummed to life. The bubble of reality expanded. The demons in the ship were cut off from their source. They faded away or were easily killed by the surviving crew. The ship was safe. Guts fell off the dissipating corpse. He landed on the deck. He retrieved his sword. He sat down against the generator. He was covered in blue coolant and black blood. He looked at his hand. It was shaking. The brand faded to a dull scar. The god hand had failed this time, but they would try again. They always tried again. Coteaz limped over to him. The Inquisitor was holding his side. His face was pale. He looked at Guts. He saw the man wiping the gore off the sword with a piece of a dead demon's cape. Coteaz realized the magnitude of what had happened. A single man had killed a greater demon and saved a black ship. This was not heresy. This was a miracle, but it was a dark miracle. Coteaz sat down on a crate opposite Guts. He did not raise his hammer. He took off his helmet. He looked human for the first time. He asked Guts what he was. Guts said he was just a human. Coteaz laughed a painful laugh. He said no human fights like that. He said Guts was something the Imperium had not seen before. He was a blank space in the fate of the galaxy. The ship arrived at Terra 2 weeks later. It orbited the throne world. The view from the window was magnificent. The planet was a city of gold and light. Tens of thousands of ships moved in the void. Guts stood on the observation deck. He was wearing clean clothes. His armor had been repaired by the best artificers of the Inquisition. It was now black ceramite with the symbol of the Inquisition engraved on the shoulder. It was small and subtle. Coteaz came to stand beside him. The Inquisitor had recovered. He held a data slate. He told Guts the terms of the arrangement. Guts was officially dead. The records would show that the prisoner died during transport. Guts would not be executed. He would not be freed. He would become a shadow agent of the Ordo Malleus. Coteaz explained the offer. There were monsters in the galaxy that the Grey Knights could not touch because of their dogma. There were places where the light of the Emperor did not reach. Coteaz needed a weapon that could go into the dark and not come back corrupted. He needed a man who had already been through hell and survived. He told Guts that he would have a ship. He would have supplies. He would have the Dragonslayer, and he would be pointed at the biggest monsters in the universe. Guts looked at the golden planet. He didn't care about the Imperium. He didn't care about the Emperor. But he knew one thing. The Apostles were here. The God Hand was reaching into this reality. If he stayed in the cell, he would be useless. If he went out, he could hunt. He could find them. He could kill them. I have a condition, Guts said. Name it, Coteaz replied. I need a crew, Guts said. Not soldiers, not fanatics. I need people who can survive. Coteaz nodded. I have a list of penal legions, outcasts, snipers, killers. You can take your pick. Guts touched the hilt of his sword. And one more thing. If I see the White Hawk, I kill him, no matter who he is to you or your emperor. Coteaz did not know who the White Hawk was. He assumed it was a Chaos Lord. If he is a demon, he dies. That is the law. Guts smirked. Good. The deal was struck. It was a contract signed in blood. Guts turned away from the window. He walked toward the hangar bay. He had a new war to fight. The scale was different. The enemies were different. But the struggle was the same. He was the struggler, and the galaxy was a target-rich environment. The narrative of Guts in the 41st millennium did not end in glory. It did not end in peace. It became a whisper in the archives, a legend among the Inquisition. They spoke of a Black Swordsman who appeared on worlds consumed by the warp. They spoke of a man who killed things that could not die. He was not a hero. He was a necessity. He was the answer to the question, what happens when a man refuses to submit to fate? The answer was simple. He swings his sword. Guts boarded his new ship. It was a stealth frigate painted matte black. He sat in the captain's chair. It was uncomfortable. He preferred standing. He looked at the star map. There were red zones everywhere. The cicatrix maledictum was a bleeding wound across the sky. Guts pointed at the biggest red stain on the map. Go there, he said to the pilot servitor. The engines fired. The ship turned away from the light of terror and headed for the Great Rift. Guts closed his eye and rested his hand on the iron slab. The brand pulsed once, softly. It was a heartbeat. The nightmare continued, and Guts was ready to wake up and fight it. The file on the entity known as the Black Swordsman was sealed by the order of the High Lords of Terror within 3 days of his departure. It was classified under the highest level of threat and authorized only for the eyes of the inquisitorial representative. There was no parade for the man who saved the Fortress of Judgment. There was only silence. The black stealth frigate slipped into the warp and vanished from the sensors of the solar segmentum. It was a drop of ink falling into a black ocean. Years passed, then decades. The galaxy continued to burn. The Indomitus crusade pushed back the darkness, but for every world save 2 were lost. However, strange reports began to drift back from the sectors bordering the Great Rift. Imperial Guard regiments reported finding battlefields where the enemy was already dead. They found orcs chopped into pieces so small they could not be identified. They found tyrannid swarms that had been broken by a force of blunt trauma rather than laser fire. They found chaos shrines that had been smashed to rubble. The soldiers whispered stories around their campfires. They spoke of a giant who walked through the artillery barrages without flinching. They spoke of a sword that sounded like a bell tolling for the dead. The commissars executed men for spreading these rumors, calling it superstition. But the Inquisition knew better. Lord Coteaz watched the data streams from his throne. He saw the pattern. It was a trail of destruction that did not follow strategic logic. It followed ascent. Deep in the warp, the great powers stirred. Khorne looked upon the carnage and felt a strange emotion. It was not pleasure. It was jealousy. Slaanesh tasted the agony of the apostles who were hunted down one by one and found the flave bitter. Tzeentch tried to weave the threads of fate to trap the human, but the threads kept snapping. The man did not follow the path. He broke the path. On a demon world inside the Eye of Terror, a white castle stood upon the mountain of crystal. It was a place of perfect beauty in a realm of madness. A figure in silver armor shaped like a hawk stood on the balcony looking out at the swirling skies. He held a helmet in his hands. He felt a vibration in the fabric of reality. It was a familiar feeling. It was the feeling of a hound closing in on the fox. The hawk smiled. He knew that the game was not over. The board had changed and the pieces were different, but the players remained the same. The chronicle ends here not with a conclusion, but with a warning. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there is also something else. There is a man who refuses to die, and as long as he draws breath, the monsters of the dark are not the hunters. They are the prey. The struggling continues.